Alright, so after we've done all of our final grading, our final painting and layout and everything like that, we are ready to move on to the finishing touches of the image. So let me start off with bringing in an image of Leinster, and I'll just select it all and copy and paste it in my image, and let me just enlarge it to fit the screen. So we'll be using this to get a little bit more of a photographic look. So let's set it to linear dodge. And maybe let's lower the opacity somewhat. And let's go into the blending options. And we're gonna do maybe something like this. To this to key out the shadows from our Leinster. So we only get the specks of dirt itself. And let's also have a look at maybe reducing it here. Now let's do it like this. So we reduce it more from the highlights. Only maybe this much. Alright, that's quite cool. Let's maybe... Okay, let's switch it back to normal real quick. And let's actually go into image, adjustments, curves. And let's change up the colors a little bit. I think I want something a little bit cooler. Like this maybe. Let's plug these back in. That looks quite good. Let's see, maybe we can move it a little bit. And we can make a mask. And if any parts are a little bit too much, we can just softly erase them a little bit. That's nice. It gives it a bit of a more of a photographic look. Maybe let's get an extra piece of Leinster here. And maybe some more in here. Okay, let's put these together and call this Leinster. Next, let's create some light wrap for the bright parts of the image to slightly wrap around dark parts. So let's just make a new layer and let's go to image, apply image, and let's copy this a couple of times. And let's go to filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and let's blur it quite widely. And let's set this to lighten. And let's just create a layer mask and invert it. And let's pick a soft round brush. And let's set the opacity to maybe 30. And let's just overpaint these, because what you would get in this scenario is you would have the background be slightly blown out in terms of the exposure, because the exposure is actually set to be quite high here, because we can see deep into the shadows, which are quite dark. So logically, anything that is bright should be a little bit overexposed, and we would get this sort of light bleeding effect in our camera into the darker areas here as well, I think. And maybe this one, let's blur a little bit less. If you click Ctrl Alt F, you go back to your last filter that you used. Let's set this to lighten as well. And let's do the same thing again around the parts of the image that we feel would benefit. Okay, and I'm kind of aiming to have these three layers have different levels of blur that I can then add. This one let's make really slight. And let's just paint over. Oops, set the lighten, and let's just paint over these edges even more. Okay, let's group these together and call them light wrap. Next, let's add some motion blur to this spaceship and this one, and maybe this as well. So let's again go to image, apply image, and let's click OK. And so now we take our applied image and let's duplicate it. And this is the reason why we do all of these steps at the end in Photoshop, because suddenly we have to combine a lot of these layers onto one layer, and it's a destructive workflow. So we want to do it as late as possible. So let's go to blur and radial blur. And the thing about radial blur is that we get this little square to represent our whole canvas, and it's really not perfect because it's hard to kind of figure out where this little center is in relation to your image. So let's test it out by putting up a large amount, and let's just go for draft quality. Okay, so currently we're slightly off. The center seems to be here. I want it to be zooming towards this area, maybe the temple itself. So let's Control Z and then Control Alt F, and let's move this a little bit. Okay, that looks quite accurate. Everything is zooming towards my main temple in the far background. So let's disable that again, and let's change the quality to best and amount to, let's say 10. That's still too much. Let's do 5. That is still a bit much. We could lower it to 3 maybe. Yeah, that looks quite good. So let's just create a layer mask for this and invert it. In here, let's just paint over this spaceship. Actually, we could go into our airships and get the mask. Paint using this. Let's select, modify, expand by 5 pixels, and select, modify, feather by 3. And let's paint this in now. Still not perfect. Let's go over this edge. Okay, and I think we can do maybe not that much for that one. Let's use our duplicated layer and duplicate it again, and we'll change this to amount 2 and We'll paint over it here. If we can do the same for this. And let's add a bit of blur to this one. We can just actually, because it will just be for this one, let's go to filter, blur, motion blur. And this one is much easier to determine. Okay, and let's just paint the effect in over it. Okay, great. Let's group these and call these motion blur. And actually what we could do as well, we could select our waterfalls in the foreground and add some motion blur to them. So let's just, well, yeah, let's just apply the image again with just these selected. And let's split this one onto a different layer. Select this one. And let's go to filter, blur, motion blur. And we can add a bit of motion blur to the falling water, which really makes things look more in motion and animated. So we paint a little bit here. That's pretty cool. And let's go to our other side here. And let's turn this slightly this way. And let's paint some in here. Quite subtle, but it makes it look more realistic if anyone pays that close of attention. Let's create a new layer and let's fill it with black, and then switch to white and change opacity to 50 and fill with white to get the perfect gray color, 50% gray. And let's just go to filter, noise, add noise, and this will do. And we're just gonna set this to soft light, and we'll change the opacity to 25%. And let's zoom in a little bit. Okay, so currently we have an even distribution of grain in the shadows and in the highlights. And that's one thing I dislike. Another is that I think the grain is a little bit too small. Let's just select maybe this portion of it and enlarge it over the whole image. Let's zoom in. And let's just compare. Okay, maybe that's slightly too large. Let's do it with this much. Okay, so the other thing is that there should be less grain in the highlights and more in the shadows, because that is where your camera picks up less information. So we'll probably want to go into blending options, and for the underlying layer, let's turn this down for the highlights, and maybe let's feather it. So now the darker the part of the painting is, the more grain it receives. Okay, so we'll call this grain. Alright, next thing we'll do is control the blur and the sharpness a little bit more. So let's apply the image first. And let's zoom in. So currently what I'm unhappy about, maybe even zoom into 200%. What I'm unhappy about is that there is a difference in the sharpness between some of the photo elements that I used, for example these, and the CG render. It is much sharper. For example here and here our photo reference is much lower quality, and that really ruins the realism of the image. So what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate this, and the bottom one we'll go to filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and blur it by maybe 1 pixel. And let's duplicate that again. And this one, let's go to, oh no, sorry. Let's first copy our blurred layer. And then we will take our blurred layer and sharpen it. So that currently might be too much blur. Let's reduce it slightly more. So we'll take our applied image and go to filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and let's just blur it by half a pixel. We are just trying to blur it just enough so that the CG becomes as soft and blurry as the photo elements. And then we will copy this layer and go to sharpen it. And this sharpens it back up to the level where it previously was. But now all of your elements are of the same quality. There's none of this 1 pixel sized noise. It becomes much more unified throughout. And this is a very, very slight touch, but it helps a lot to, again, bring a slightly photographic quality to your image. So let's delete that. Let's delete this as well, and we'll call this blur/sharp, and we'll duplicate this again. And another thing we want to do is slightly blur the background, as that happens with distance. So again, let's maybe blur it. Okay, let's try half a pixel. We want this to be a very slight effect as well. Okay, maybe another half a pixel. And now let's take our depth pass from earlier. And let's just clear the layer style. Okay, and now in our blur sharp copy, we will create a layer mask, and we will go to image, apply image, and we will apply this depth to our alpha mask. Okay, we can disable this. And now this will be more blurry where it is white. So we want it more blurry, kind of just in the far background. So let's use the curves. And do something like this. So we'll call this blur VG. So now we are slightly blurring our background. And lastly, we are once again going to apply our image onto a new layer. And let's zoom in. Okay, maybe a little bit more. And let's duplicate this. And let's select the first copy and go to Image Adjustments Curves. And let's select our red channel. And just pick the top handle and drag it all the way to the bottom. And this gives us a very cyan result. Let's select our second copy. And again go to Image Adjustments Curves. And select our green handle and drag it all the way down. Click OK. And now select your pink layer and just go to change it to lighten. So now it looks like there is no effect, but if we click Ctrl+T to scale it, and then here make sure this little lock or chain link is enabled, and scale this up by maybe 0.01 in order to get some chromatic aberration around the edges of our image. So this is off and this is on, and you want this to be very subtle. You don't want to put on something like, not even this, that's just 1%. So even just 0.1% is too much. So yeah, I tend to do 0.1. And maybe actually, I think we might be able to go up to 0.25. Okay, let's group these and call them chromatic aberration. And you see, this is a slight photographic effect of light being bent by the camera lens. Okay, so that is our full complete concept made using Photoshop and Clarice. Next up, we will have a look at transforming this concept into a moving shot. We will discuss the problems that we will encounter along the way and different solutions, what things work better just doing it as an image and leaving it in 2D, and how some of these things can be done in different ways when approaching it from a production point of view when making a moving shot. So I hope you've enjoyed it this far, and let's move on to the next stage.